Thank you very much for these pleasant words and for emphasizing the role of the Prague European Summit and also putting this event into the European and global context. I think it's very important to bear all this information in mind because when we are discussing about all these issues that were mentioned, we need to take in mind all the context that was mentioned here with the war in the edge of Europe, let's say, and with, let's say, look at the future of the European Union that hopefully in next year will enlarge. So thank you very much, organizers, for these nice words about the perspectives of Europe. And now it's time to start with the first panel discussion. We will start with the topic of the EU geoeconomics after the Russian-Ukrainian war. Before, let me only tell you a few organizational words. This year you can, of course, join the discussion and you can use it, you can do it via Slido application. In the materials you got from the organizers, you can find a leaflet where are all the details, how you can find the application, how you can ask your questions. It's the website Slido, and you can find this event under hashtag PES, PES 2022. So there you can find the discussion and you can ask questions via this application. So that's from the organizational part, let's say, and now I would like to invite moderator and speakers of the first event, and I would like to pass the floor to them. So I would like to ask Mr. Ondřej Houska to come here, because Ondřej Houska is the moderator of the first panel discussion. For those who are from the Czech Republic, I think that I don't have to introduce you, Ondřej, because we are all reading his articles and analyses. And for those who are from abroad, Ondřej is one of the leading Czech journalists who are covering EU policies. So I'm glad that I can welcome Ondřej here, and I would like to also ask the speakers of the first panel to join us here and to take their seats. So please, if you can come here. And yeah, so we will start with the first discussions, and I will now pass the floor to my colleague Ondřej Houska from Hospodářské noviny. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Does it work? Because we were not instructed how to use the mic, if we should switch it on or if it's already switched on. So hopefully it works. Thank you so much, Aneta. I'm happy that I'm one of the leading Czech journalists dealing with the EU, since there are maybe 3 of us. It's not that difficult, but anyway, it's a pleasure and a compliment, of course. So as said, the first panel is entitled "The EU's Geo-economics after the Russian-Ukrainian war." Honestly, this morning I googled the word geoeconomics. What does it mean? Because I guess that it can mean many things to many people. And according to Wikipedia, one of the possible definitions is that geoeconomics is the study of the interrelations of economics, geography, and politics. So whatever that means, I think that we'll be talking, among other things, about if and how the EU should use its immense economic power as the biggest trading bloc in the world to achieve political and geopolitical goals. And we have a distinguished panelists, of course, starting with Belén Martinez Carbonell, who's managing director for global agenda and multilateral relations at the European External Action Service. Professor Kataryna Wolczuk from Chatham House and the University of Birmingham. Jaroslav Kurfürst, who's Czech Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs for European Affairs. And Ondřej Ditrych, whom you know already. He's the director of the Institute of International Relations. As mentioned by Aneta, please ask your questions. We'll be super happy to answer them. Use Slido. with the hashtag PS2022 and then use and select a room with the name of this panel, and then please ask your questions. So we have about an hour. So let me start with a general point about the current environment. Of course, we are living in the context of the Russian aggression and China's policies more and more assertive. So my question is the EU in this context, is the EU becoming, as mentioned in the panel, a decisive geoeconomic power, or are we still very far from that? Ms. Martinez Carbonell, please start.
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot to the Czech presidency and the organizers for this interesting event and for inviting me to attend. I would like to take us a bit to where Ondřej, that's your name, was starting early on, is that this discussion is going to be rightly so about the post-Russian invasion world, but we need to keep in mind what the world before 24th February was. And there were many other crises that were already bringing Europe into a change mindset. I mean, we were recovering from COVID. We were addressing what Secretary General Guterres calls the triple planetary crisis, which is climate, pollution, and biodiversity loss. And through all of that, we had already clicked that the internal external boundaries of our policy making had been blurred and disappear. And if you read the US national security strategy just came out, is one of their points that they make. So I think there was already a change going on in European politics, and all this has just accelerated. It's a sign of a response to the Russian aggression on Ukraine. So one of the rare silver linings of all of this is that Europe has sped up its adjusting of its policy making to address the challenges that are accelerated and emphasized by the crisis. So that, to me, it's very important to keep in mind. But indeed, Russia's war of aggressions in Ukraine has affected the EU position in the global markets. It has affected because it had a devastating effect on our economy. It has had a devastating effect on the world economy. But I do think that Europe has reacted to all of this better than many people would have bet on a few years ago. And because we learned from the lessons of COVID, and we were very creative through COVID on financial responses and united responses, and we've taken this to that. So we have immediately tried to respond to the food crisis, and we have organized the solidarity lanes, which was again an internal, external, foreign policy, economic response to a very acute need for the European continent, for the world, and that has been important. The world is watching us. And on energy, we have done super amazing things. And a third strand of two more strands of actions where I think has been important is on we have been addressing the rising debt burdens. So the proposals that the European Commission has put forward today, and they're going to be discussed in the coming weeks about how to redo the work, I mean, the European debt, how to have a new approach to European financial gaps, and also how we've been working and how to address the world debt burdens. Because something we see in the aftermath of the Russian aggression, in the aftermath of the COVID, is that Europe and the Western world luckily has margin in its economic cushion to address some of these challenges the rest of the world has not. And we have been, again, supportive of those out there that are ready to change the international financial institutions and the way it works. So I think that overall EU has been quite reactive and proactive. This being said, I want to leave with you immediately some positive message, is that despite all of this, EU and the perception that some might have that we're going in through difficult times because of the Russian aggression, so that China economic power is undermining us, the EU is still ranked first since more than a decade as the first trade power in the world. And I think that's something on which we have to capitalize. That's the positive side. The other positive side is that we have sharply and speedily curtailed our reliance from Russia. And that is something positive that we will take with us for the next years. Our dependence from China, on the contrary, is probably more than we wished. And there we need to do better, but there are certain limitations of reality. We have a dependence on raw materials and on rare earth materials from from China that undermine our wish to become totally energy independent from Russia and to complete our green transition. I can give you some examples. China still accounts for 90% of our magnesium needs, 90% of our rare earth requirements, 80% of the solar panels, and that is something to bear in mind. So economically, we haven't done as much in terms of our independence from China as we are doing in energy terms and politically disconnecting from Russia. I could continue, but maybe I'll leave it there and then.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Professor Wolczuk. Are we becoming a decisive geoeconomic power or not yet?
Should work. Thank you so much. The answer, as usual, sitting on the fence, is yes and no. And I think when we talk about the EU, we really have to differentiate between the institutions and the member states. And it's the question of one Europe or several. And I think in terms of the difficulties and process, I think it's very important to realize that the EU is a victim of its own success story in terms of overcoming wars, conflict and rivalries on the European continent and developing this post-geopolitical and identity in terms of what we've achieved in Europe can be spread beyond. And it takes some tectonic shifts to realize that actually the world outside is not as benign as we would like it to be. And especially when we talk about globalization, other countries like China and Russia talked about sovereign globalization, that it's a one-way street in terms of actually making the EU dependent in energy or economic terms, and through this building political leverage vis-à-vis the countries. And although I've been working on the East, especially on Russia, but also some work on China for a long time, and we know that this has been coming. If we watched what's been happening in Moldova, not on Ukraine, but Moldova or Armenia, we would have known that this is coming. And we've known, but it has been, in a way, in slow motion. But because the leverage is such that our interests, European and national interests, are so dependent, that costs are too high, not for Europe as a whole, but very often for individual member states or even individual regions or sort of companies inside the EU. So the EU is at its best, paradoxically, when it has to go outside its comfort zone. And this has happened with the shock because of the war. So what we've seen, this scrambling to deliver, despite the massive and full agenda already, it's almost if you want something done, give it to a busy person or a busy institution. And that's the EU. The agenda was full already, and suddenly things which were not possible. I was sitting in so many events on Nord Stream 2, and every single panel always finished with the same. We know it is risky, but we have no choice. We have to go ahead. So we cannot do it until we have to do it. So this is the situation. So we are learning, we are adapting, we are catching, but we are also Europe of different speeds. And in a way, it's easier vis-à-vis Russia because the tectonic, this tsunami is happening, so we know we have to do it. But with China, we are still in a bit of sort of slumber that it's like climate change, it's coming, but it's not quite there, so we still have time to think about it. So this is Europe is in the process of catching up. We are not quite there, but at least we are using the right language and starting to talk the talk. And that's in Europe, that's the most important step that we have to take.
Thank you, Deputy Minister Kurfürst. Does the Czech Republic wish that the EU becomes a decisive geo-economic power? Because Czech Republic has traditionally been a champion of free trade, promoting free trade deals, EU free trade deals all around the world. To become geo-economic power, you probably have to use defensive instruments also, which one might call protectionist, which is something that Czechia has been traditionally totally against. So what's the Czech view?
Thank you so much for that question. My answer, I will give you my answer. I don't think that the Czech government took a position on the geo-economic position of the European Union. My answer is yes. And I would say this answer is very connected with the character of the European Union, because your previous question, whether the EU is the geo-economic power, it's also yes. That's the reality. Because the European Union, well, let's define what is geo-economics. There is economy, which is about the profit, but geo-economy is different. This is using the economic tools for the geopolitical goals. So sometimes that particular project we are investing in is not economically interesting in the short run, but it's important for your security or for maybe the longer run goals, etc. So in that respect, the EU is basically having in the DNA the geoeconomics. How the EU was about to be created, steel and coal was put together. This is a geoeconomical move. The atomic energy was put together, the internal market, and the common currency. Of course, it's cheaper and economic-wise it's interesting, but this is a geo-economic move. So basically, EU is a geo-economic power, definitely yes. And but what is the difference between the EU and, let's say, China or the authoritarian regimes like Russia? Always there should be the economic logic behind the geo-economic project. So you come, let's say, to, I will not name, but to one country, and there is a China state construction company building the highway. Well, I don't know whether that highway is really economically feasible. That's maybe the interest of geoeconomics. The EU is able to combine that, and it's been quite successful in that. Of course, if you look back, there are some internal geoeconomical projects for the EU building itself, but also some external policies. Let's take free trade area agreement or free trade agreements. Let's take the DCFTA and the Eastern Partnership. Eastern Partnership as such is a geoeconomic project, I would say quite successful geoeconomic project, which was much more attractive for democratic countries in the Eastern neighborhood than Eurasian Union, which would be maybe another geoeconomic project. But EU is now in this new environment, which is so densely drawn into the geopolitics, learning how to use also the restrictive geoeconomical tools, sanctions, de-swifting of banks, all kinds of embargoes. So many things which are, of course, connectivity and, for example, the energy, solidarity, common platforms for the purchase of the energy, all kinds of mechanisms, third energy package, interconnectors. This is all to the geo-economic reaction on Russia cutting the gas 2006 and 9, and then aggression to Ukraine for the first time in Crimea 14, and then now. So my answer is yes, because the EU is a geo-economic project as such.
Okay, we in this country, I think we have quite a tradition of building projects that are not economically feasible, but that's another story. Ondřej, Ditrych, your take.
Okay, I'll go with a safe response. So not yet, but I think there is a significant potential, and it should not be wasted, of course. And to do that, we need to square one very small, simple circle to strike a good balance between maintaining the benefits of the interconnected world on one hand and reducing the risks that interdependence entails. We don't want to deglobalize. We don't want to be isolated. our economic models are not based on that. But we need to have means in place to deal with disruptions. We need to expect that these disruptions will continue to protect critical assets and supply chains. This is what economic resilience is about, in my understanding. We need to defend against coercive economic diplomacy. And I think we've shown that this is a positive story for me. We've shown that we are capable of that vis-à-vis Russia, that we don't get intimidated. And we need to think in long term. And we also need geo-economic clout in our external relations, because we live in the world where dependencies are increasingly weaponized, where the sense prevails that critical value chains must be protected in the increasingly competitive geopolitical environment. We live in the time of resurgent sovereignty, which manifests itself in many forms, including tendencies to neo-mercantilism. So we have economic neoliberalism being challenged by these neo-mercantilist policies. And it is in this context I understand that the geo-economic turn has been originally proclaimed, though so far mostly related to US-China competition. And we now try even to kind of define conceptually what we mean by European geo-economic power. But to follow on very briefly on this external dimension, how do I see this geo-economic cloud that the EU should have to develop? I think we should succeed in marginalizing Russia in the third markets, in Africa, in the post-Soviet space, and we have the geopolitical plan in place now, and I very much hope that it comes to fruition. We need to engage the middle powers, challenging as it may be, India, Turkey, Latin America, including to prevent the, say, regime leakage, as we academics say, in the sanctions regime, to mitigate the costs that it imposes on us while maximizing the cost that it imposes on the target state, the Russian Federation in this case. And last but not least, and this is of course not a pickle either, we, I think, need to have more clarity on China. As part of this broader rebalancing in Asia or Indo-Pacific, what Joseph Borrell calls the new center of gravity, and there's a good point to be made there, because that's where 60% of the global GDP is produced. It accounts for 2/3 of the global growth, and it produces some very key components that keep the digital economy running, including the semiconductors that have been mentioned. I just read a few days ago that the chips from Taiwan now account for 37% of world's new computing power every year. And with China, we have this familiar triangle of rival, competitor, and partner. But my question is, can it really be so neatly compartmentalized anymore? And isn't it just too convenient to stay in this triangle, in this suspension of these three principles? It seems to me that Chancellor Scholz, judging on his recent visit to China, still tries for some sort of balancing act with China. But I think the winds are changing here as well. First, because Germany and the United States no longer are on the opposite end of the trade balance. Germany doesn't have a surplus in trade with China anymore due to flattening exports and a surge in Chinese exports the other way around. And sure, the sudden loss of 2.5 or 2.7, the GDP share out of China exports as a result of some sort of sudden decoupling would hurt Germany a lot. But it's not like economists like Adam Tooze have argued about this, quite recently. It's not like exports to China are kind of a major driver of economic growth of Germany as the European economic powerhouse anymore. And actually the same seems to go for Russian gas, actually. On that note, I would like to end. I think that to have geo-economic clout means to be able to provide good offers and also to have certain expectations regarding our partners. And I think the EU has managed to put some very good offers on the table. The global gateway to create smart, clean, and secure links. The Indo-Pacific Strategy 2021, which stresses, among other things, the local benefits, ownership of digital connectivity. But I think there is more to be done in terms of convincing our allies or potential allies, that playing by the rules, having good governance in place, and going green and clean is the gateway to a prosperous future. And while our unnamed systemic competitors may offer, short-term benefits, not to the whole societies, but to some, who happen to be in the decision-making capacity. And there is intrinsic value in equal, say, non-predatory relationship. But we also need to be empathic, I think. When we speak about geopolitical or geo-economic Europe, I don't think that it can be received so well in some parts of the world, especially as we are simultaneously engaged in this battle of narratives in which Russia falsely, of course, capitalizes on its non-colonial or even counter-colonial identity. So that's where I stop for now. Thank you.
Before we go to Slido and to your questions, which you can still ask through this platform, let me ask probably the last question here from the podium. And please be very brief in your replies, starting this time with Professor Wolczuk. If you want to be a decisive power, you have to have common goals, common strategy. You have to be united in all this. Is the EU... does the EU possess that sort of strengths, or are any institutional changes needed, like this famous QMV in foreign policy, etc.? Briefly, please.
Yes, I think all the key words we've said here, in terms that we tend to, unity is one of them, and we tend to compartmentalize. We think something is politics, something is trade or investment. And one thing that we need to do is really sort of joined up thinking in terms of how we think our partners, our competitors don't have this sort of silos. They think an integrated way, not only in the Chinese policy vis-à-vis the EU, but also, for example, in Africa. Whereas we have our normative identity as a force for good, and we take it for granted. Whereas China and Russia are much more effective to working with local partners and ensuring that they provide incentives and sticks, whatever is needed. So in terms of actually unity vis-à-vis the actors in bilateral relations, but also internationally. And from that point of view, I cannot see that. I can see good intentions and the narrative emerging, but there is a lot divide and rule. And if we look, for example, how is Lithuania treated by China and how is Germany treated? And we can see actually basically China courting large German business in order to persuade them that they can have a privileged access to the Chinese market. So divide and rule is something that we are not resilient to. And if one member state agrees to do something, this provides an incentive to another state to lower the barrier, basically entry barrier, and to go for certain cooperation which they may not be otherwise so inclined. So from that point of view, we have, vis-à-vis Russia, for a long time, we had two Europes. One Europe was sort of Eastern and Central Europe, when one set of rules applied, and the rest was from basically Germany to the West, Second Europe. And we thought they were separated. We've seen now the same toolbox, which was developed and applied to the post-Soviet countries, was rolled out to the West. Now we have two, so we have one Europe insofar as Russia is concerned. With China, we have still two Europes. One is Montenegro and Lithuania, another, for example, is Germany. Will they be, at which point there will be sort of, that dependence will be weaponized? We don't know, but for the time being, we are definitely, from my point of view, not quite ready, not least because of short-term costs. And we are beginning to talk the talk, but in terms of actually policy making, we are not yet quite there. And especially when it comes, for example, when it comes to Chinese investment in the EU member states. So there is a lot of homework to do, but at least as the starting point is that we are realizing, and hopefully things will become more united and resilient before another tsunami shock happens.
We can go back to this point later, of course, but I see that there are quite a few questions coming up on Slido, so you have the precedence, of course. So let me ask the first one, which is, how could we have effective EU geoeconomics without a real EU foreign policy? Who wants to reply? Huh? Of course, we have, you represent the EU foreign policy, but we all know that it has its limitations. So how would you reply?
First of all, I think that the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And if what we have put together in response to Russian aggression is not foreign policy, then what is foreign policy? So, I mean, with all due respect to all the debate about the beauty of the qualified majority voting, in fact, what is more important is the political will. And you can have all the mechanisms, process that you wish, and all the nice words in the treaty. If there isn't a joint political will of the EU 27, then you will not have a foreign policy, you will not have a common resolute. And I think that when the time has come, and this has happened in the last months, the European leaders have proven their resolve. It could have been softer, it could have been smoother, but I think part of the beauty is that of the EU project is that we invest so much into reaching our consensus that when we get there, we're super strong, and that we can see vis-a-vis the world. I mean, you take the US foreign policy, and you know they get into the electoral cycle, and the country is paralyzed for a year. We have elections that are going on. There's always an EU country is going to be in an election cycle, and it's still the machine goes on, and we manage to overcome all of that, to overcome our differences, and we don't say, but we make it. It's European foreign policy in the making. There were references earlier to how to address the dependencies from Russia, from China, and the economic kind of aggressive agenda of China. We have built instruments. We have the foreign direct investment screening, which we are working on a daily basis, and we are screening investments in Europe from, among others, China, since a little time already. We have the anti-coercive instrument, which, if it all goes well, will be cleared right now in the parliament. So we are building the system to address those problems with we can. And when necessary, we fast-track it, as we did with the consequence of the Russian aggression. What we've achieved in the UN, the support that the EU has galvanized in the UN in support of Ukraine, because as you know, all these votes in the UN is the EU has been acting as a facilitator for Ukraine, has been impressive. So I think it's time to move to action, and you know, and that be more efficient. We don't have, frankly, time today to go into, you know, wasting time on negotiating QMVs and treaty changes. That's it.
Deputy Minister, do you agree that the EU has, or the EU member states have demonstrated decisive political will, as was said, and that's what matters and not the procedures? Because one might say, okay, Ukraine, that's easy, you know, it's the biggest aggression in Europe since World War II, but more problematic matters might come.
No, I think that that question was so nicely answered. Yes, EU does have the CFSP. I think if we would have been sitting here 10 years ago, then we might have a long discussion whether CFSP does exist. But after the Russian aggression, when the EU was really learning how to use, and how maybe EU surprised itself how strong it can be, how powerful it can be, and how clear it can be that the EU can lead even more than some member states. There was always, I mean, the most powerful member states. The EU is really the one who is getting, I think, the authority and the charisma of the organization, which is reliable in, for example, Central and Eastern Europe. Always there was a debate that how in that multipolar emerging world the EU can live, because it is the world of carnivores, the world where you have, let's say, the unitarian states which are powerful, They have a single decision-making place. They have a quick decision-making chains. The decision is being taken quickly and implementing quickly. While in the EU, 27 countries meet and discuss, and this is weak as a result, and then it is slow as an implementation. But look what happened. EU surprised itself, and of course it surprised the others. But what is the most important, I think, here is that why we did that, why we were able to do it. And I would argue that because we have a very, very strong common ground, which is a lessons learned from the First and Second World War, which is basically the fact that EU is anti-imperial project, standing very strongly against that imperial and neo-colonial or colonial policy, what we see from Russia. EU is really defending the rule-based international order, and there is a common ground on that, so we can decide quickly and we can be strong. My answer is yes.
There are also questions coming up, so let's take them one by one. Does the EU have any comprehensive strategy dealing with China and Chinese efforts to dominate global economy? Director.
Not yet. I mean, there is this triangle that I mentioned, but it's like three principles that are suspended, one against each other. But maybe let me just go quickly back to the previous question. You know, I have the privilege of not being either part of the EAS or the government, and I'd just like to say maybe that it's very easy, obviously, to dismiss, you know, the EU's foreign policy, but look at the extent of the Russia sanctions. Look at the speed of the Iranian sanctions, you know, regarding the drones. And who would have said that a year ago? I think Mr. Putin wouldn't have said that. And had he guessed, you know, what was coming for him, maybe he would have been deterred, actually. And, you know, had we been more credible, you know, many people would have been alive, or at least much better off. But of course, there is this challenge of having to agree amongst 27 member states, because CFSP is a special kind of European policy, and some believe that this is where its strength come from. Some believe that we should think about, you know, changing the procedures, modifying that to be more actionable. But I mean, in any case, this is where we are at the moment. And I think going just back to geoeconomics, it was mentioned that, you know, maybe we have now a little bit of breathing time to, you know, to think through some things, and I think we should really use that time to get some conceptual clarity. I mean, you opened up with saying that, you know, you are not clear on what geoeconomics is. I think there's a lot of space for everyone to be more clear on what it means to be a geopolitical actor. What is the external and the internal dimension? You know, what are the defensive rather than protectionist measures that we can take? How we can, you know, resolve and first be clear-eyed about the difference and sometimes tensions between economic and political objectives. And this was referred to before. We need to be clear-eyed about the fact that reducing strategic dependencies imposes economic costs. It's not free. We need to be clear-eyed about, you know, the fact that better implementation of the, you know, most favored nation clauses will not likely yield much in, you know, economic terms, but it can be a very useful political instrument, for example. And I think we should aspire at least to use this time that we have to arrive at some sort of overarching concept, because the existing ones, like, you know, strategic autonomy or open strategic autonomy, they only really, in my understanding at least, they cover only portions of what this all is about, mostly the defensive part, right? And moreover, their usefulness can be limited in the case, and this has been the case, of strategic autonomy when they become a subject of controversy.
Do you think Ukraine joining the EU would increase or worsen the EU's geo-economic power? Professor Wolczuk.
Gosh, that's an interesting question. However much we need to talk about Ukraine joining, it's not going to happen anytime soon. But I think Ukraine it's really that sort of symbolic country which forces us to think strategically. what we do and how we act, and joining up in terms, because we have the enlargement policy, we have the neighborhood, we have sort of trade relations, and we have basically defense policy. All those policies, they exist in relative silos. Ukraine forces us to look at them in conjunction. They work together. Having said that, actually, what we see, because of Ukraine, our immediate priority is Russia. This paradoxically, from my point of view, actually on the one hand, galvanizes us to look into the future. On the other hand, actually weakens our resolve. Because of the cost of energy decoupling with Russia already economically high, it's sort of energy shock. We're talking about the 1970s sort of oil crisis or energy crisis in Europe. And this actually weakens the resolve and incentives to deal with China, because we cannot incur so much cost in the short term. So actually, with China, this means we cannot basically play havoc on all the fronts. So Ukraine is a galvanizing, basically, instrument for the time being. And in terms of actually where Ukraine matters, and I think Czech business and, Ukraine will need a lot of reconstruction and investment. And this needs, the US and the EU really support Ukraine, and Ukraine needs to be rebuilt, but not Chinese, Turkish businesses. It needs to be rebuilt by the allies and partners which support. And President Zelensky said he will invite anybody to rebuild Ukraine, and this has been very heavily criticized by Ukrainian civil society, that actually it is our strategic partners. And we know from the basically Central European perspective, experience that investment is actually what matters. And I really hope, because of its location and experience, that countries in Central Europe will be able to integrate Ukraine economically, not only Ukraine, but also Moldova and Georgia. So I think there is a real role to play. Thank you.
Let's go from Ukraine to Africa. What should EU do in terms of policy in improving our success in Africa? This is, of course, very much connected to China, to migration, to energy. So what should we do to improve our success in Africa? I don't know who wants to take this one. You have a strategy, right, written?
We have a strategy for everything. That's the EU, because we're a global actor. We've got a strategy and a paper for everything, including for China.
Non-paper.
Well, China will have a communication.
I know.
Council conclusions, everything. But no, on Africa, more seriously, I think the consequences of the Russian aggression have been also a wake-up call. A wake-up call for us on the importance of our relation with Africa, or even beyond Africa, what some call the global south, the rest of the world, or wherever you want to name it. But partially what we are trying to address these days is have a strategy. I mean, we have papers and papers, but not undermining those priorities, which still are the twin transition, education, migration, but trying to be much more coherent about our approach to those countries. So we are reviewing our policies, trying to see, and I put it sometimes in very simplistic terms, take country X, and we have the different EU institutions and member states throwing in our energy relations, our migration demands, our investment policies, our human rights policies, and if you sit there from the point of view of the Africa, it's all coming to you like storm, and you're there trying to stop the goals. And sometimes we realize we're not being smart enough about being coherent with all the efforts that we're putting in certain countries. So trying to prioritize countries, those middle ground countries, giving them the importance that they have, because they are opinion makers, they're kind of triggers of change in the African region. So look at Africa with a more share of interest approach. Listening, that's something that the High Representative insists all the time. We need to listen. We need to listen at their demands. And what's going on these days in Sharm el-Sheikh is very telling. They're just telling us, this is, you're so much focused on Ukraine these days, what's happening to us, and that's something we need to take care of, because we need Africa for our geostrategic power, because Africa is the fastest growing continent and economy, and it's just there a few kilometers away. I come from Spain. You can sit on the coast and you see the African houses across the other side of the sea. So we need to be smarter, we need to listen, and we need to address their concerns. And I'll finish with this. I think besides the battle of the narratives, what we realize as well is that we have the battle of the offers. And it's not enough to go to the Africans and to other countries with, here's our menu, here's how we think you should run your countries, and this is good for you. No, they're not looking at it like that. They're looking at our offer, they're looking at the Chinese offer, and we need to prove that in substance, it's better for them to buy our offer. And that's what we're trying to do these days, to review our approach.
So less lecturing, more substance. There was something that your boss stressed recently, right? Yes. If I remember correctly, among other things, of course. Is the war and resulting limitations on Russian gas helping to reinvigorate a transition to cleaner, safer nuclear energy? We can probably say that the image of nuclear has improved quite a lot this year. So is there something like a consensus in the EU? There's probably not, but is the EU more permissive, or EU member states more permissive? Are they more permissive towards nuclear being used as a part of this clean transition? I don't know who's an expert on nuclear here. If no one, then.
I think this will be covered in other panels, and one aspect that in a way our challenge is because the policies are quite sophisticated. I can say that actually I don't know enough about energy and sort of the Green Deal, etc. So that's the challenge for us, knowing what is feasible, what is doable, and what is the right toolbox. And I'm happy to put my hands up that actually, the Green Deal, etc. It's not exactly my forte. So I'm only too happy to be educated by the following panels.
Well, there is International Atomic Energy who is telling us Europe will not make it without nuclear energy. Nuclear energy is a really indispensable part of the mix. And definitely in that country, the look at it is very positive and we want to develop it. I think that in the European Union in general, there is more permissive environment towards the nuclear energy. Of course, there always will be those who are against that. Some of them on the basis of ideology, the others on the basis of fear. The first group, that's difficult because if you are a fan of Sparta or Slavia, then you will not change the dress just because someone is explaining. That's basically maybe the lost energy. But those who are having the fear, I think you can manage with the transparency. And also the technological advance is here, which is on the horizon. They are small nuclear modular reactors, etc. I think it's technologically very important to invest into it, and it's of course for the environment and all the green dreams and the green future, it's important. So basically, I believe, yes, nuclear is living through the renaissance, and I believe that trend will continue.
What are the concrete policy proposals or solutions that make the EU independent from China when it comes to rare earths? So that's a question we should tackle, because we were talking about the need to be more independent, but how to do it, how to replace Chinese, or replace not 100%, but lessen the dependence. Is there a way, a strategy? Is it possible, is it realistic to open new mines in Europe? There is lithium, for example, in Europe, but this NIMBY attitude is quite pronounced.
I'm not sure whether there is a strategy, to what extent this is being discussed, but yes, China is not the only country in the world that produces, that mines rare earths. There are rare earth deposits in Europe, in the high north, for example, in the Barents Sea region. So maybe that's something I'm not sure to what extent it can hedge, can substitute for the needs that we have. In the short, medium term, probably not. But in the long term, this is possibly what we should be looking at.
We don't have economic experts in this panel. If one of you is, then correct me. But so I don't know that if we are able to answer the next question. But let me read it at least. Can the Czech Republic have success in EU single market without being in euro area? There's a debate that's going on for years. But I don't know if anyone is willing to reply. To say no, that we're not able to succeed without euro area membership, this is not a strategy you can win elections with in this country.
But paradoxically, I'll just say something from Poland. We are in exactly the same boat. So the longer we stay outside, the more difficult it is to persuade, because the countries have been successful, and saying that actually we would do even better is not necessarily. Especially given the euro sort of problems, there are ups and downs. So I cannot see this, at least in Poland, becoming something which we're going to be discussing very intensively. I'm curious to find out, in Czechia, what's the situation? Perhaps you are more enthusiastic.
Maybe I will take it. It's similar. Czechia is successful in the internal market. And euro is not having the euro is not a big handicap for the Czech businesses. Of course, for many it would be easier to have euros and to do not have this exchange obstacle, etc. But this is not so dramatic, and it's a political decision. And as many political decisions, QMV is one, euro is the other. It has to mature, and. What we see now, this is a quick maturing of the European, let's say, project. I don't like very much the word project, but of the European Union as a player, as a geo-economical player, definitely, geopolitical player. And maybe little by little it will move also the moods in Poland or Czechia. But for now, there is no need. And of course, I think that the major moment was really the debt crisis, banking crisis, euro crisis. So the time frame from 2010 or 9 until 2013, that was a devastating period when the population in, for example, Czechia, to speak for Czechs, started to not to believe that this is a tenable project when you have the countries which are not having the public finances, but also the banking system, etc., in a good shape. And it takes time. So there is a maturing of the EU as such. There is a confidence to the, let's say, good shape of Eurozone as such, including the individual countries. And then it will mature through, I guess.
Yeah.
Just 2 words. I personally happen to think there are both economic costs not being part of the euro area, and there are also political costs of not having pooled sovereignty in monetary policy. But it's an issue on which there is a diversity of positions. I think, well, what does it mean to be successful in the single market? I think where we definitely will fail economically is if we don't manage the digital and green transition. This is what the summit is about. It may be less about the euro at the current point of time than this.
But now the Czech sovereign debt is rising the fastest in the whole EU, so maybe this can change the equation. Of course, to enter Eurozone out of panic would be probably the worst possible decision, but okay, I'm not an economic expert, I'm just a journalist. What economic policy should the EU adopt regarding countries that didn't decisively condemn Russian aggression, like Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, etc.? Yeah, sure.
I think with your listing you have included different countries in that mixed bag, and there are different types of countries when it comes of condemning Russian aggression. You have the countries who stood with us, that's clear, and then there were the countries that abstained, and sometimes an abstention implied more of an effort. If you think of Cuba abstaining, that was more symbolic, the yes of other countries. There were also countries who move in their vote. We had Brazil, who first did abstain, and then when it came to the annexation of the territory, that's getting serious, and then he voted yes. And then you had countries that were in a catch-22 position. You know, if you think a country like Mongolia, I mean, you're not going to force that country to take a choice, to make a choice, because, you know, its geographic situation does not allow it for more. And we can't move countries in the world. That's where they are. They will stay physically. So they have to live also with their circumstances. The approach we've taken is that we haven't put anybody into a blacklist, because that would have been, if anything, counter positive. What the reading of the vote has been a wake-up call about to which countries we have to reach out. And it's not by chance that we're making a super effort to reach out to India, and that we are launching this TTC process with India, because we realize that India is important and we can't afford not to have a good relation with India. And that's the way we need to think about many countries. Reading that list, I mean, I'm not thinking of Belarus, because then, you know, I'm sorry, we don't even try. We don't even demarche when we go for a vote, because what's the point? But there are countries where the reading of the vote was a call for us about how we need to approach them and how we need to present the offer of the battle of the offers. And that's, I think, how we need to work.
That was so well answered that I don't have any addition, but you inspired me by India, the country which is basing the public diplomacy and its identity on non-violence. The country which has such a great history of struggle against colonial rule. Looking at that conflict, well, that's the reason to think about.
Yes, please.
I think the two comments actually answer our need to have this tailored policy. And for example, it's India versus South Africa versus Belarus. So we cannot have that blanket policy, but we need to know the circumstances and why and what we can do. And ultimately, when it comes to India, they do regard themselves as a great power, and they are standing up, and they are not going to listen to us. We can persuade, but we have to know our limits. And that's, from that point of view, the tailored approach is needed. And going back, doing business in Africa, knowing the local knowledge. It's not because our foreign policy making is so difficult that by the end of the day we focus on back in Brussels, but actually working with the specific countries. Russia, China, and India, actually, they do it very, very well, if needed, by bribing or, you know, recruiting clients, high-profile politicians to make sure that they actually serve their needs. So South Africa has been absolutely charmed by the anti-imperial narrative from Russia, from the apartheid times. So from that point of view, we need to have tailored approach, we need to be differentiated, but also be realistic in terms of actually what we can do, and at which point to intervene. Some most difficult cases, and we have to have a different approach vis-a-vis South Africa versus what's on our doorstep, Serbia. The fact that actually Serbia is not really aligned with our foreign policy. This is much more tricky, and it does require a response. And I'll just say on the sort of Belarus, for my purposes, we really cannot regard Belarus as a fully fledged sovereign country anymore. It is de facto creeping. We're talking about creeping annexation by Russia. Yeah.
Very briefly, please.
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, I will not speak about India. That was well said before. But maybe going back to Africa, of course, I think we need more coherence. We need more visibility for the substantial things that we are already doing. But we also need to appreciate that we are operating in a very complex, sometimes difficult environment when there is a military junta who fears for its political survival. In Mali, well, they turn to the Wagner group, and then gets, sell some concessions, along the way. So what are kind of the normative red lines which we are able to maintain in order to engage with these kind of actors? Obviously, it gets much more easier when it's not, one authoritarian government talking to another authoritarian government, because it's easy for them to talk to each other. But when we have vibrant societies and vibrant economies and people who understand that, the offer that we are able to give in the long term is the only one that actually it's the best offer on the table. In the short term, you can bribe, you can corrupt, but in the long term, and maybe that's one way. I mean, there are no easy fixes. Even when talking to, not always very savory characters, on the other side, when you explain that there is a pragmatic perspective to this, when we extend let's say the time frame of those offers, maybe that's one possible way out of this dilemma. And obviously, there are a lot of dilemmas involved in this.
Since we're in Central Europe, let's take a question about Central Europe. Has the Russian war in Ukraine changed the power dynamics in the EU in favor of Central Europe? What would it mean for the EU as a geopolitical actor? So we've been hearing lots of self-congratulatory speech, not only in Warsaw, but even in Prague recently, about how right we were, even though those of you who are Czechs know very well that it was not always that clear what the Czech attitude towards Russia and Ukraine was in the past. But anyway, will there be any changes? And Professor, I will ask you for an answer, since you're Polish, but not based in Poland anymore. What's your take? Will the voice and power and political capital of Central Europe be greater even after the war is over?
Thank you very much. I think, it may be sort of a self-serving view, but I do believe that the center of gravity, for very justifiable reasons, because of wars, annexation, invasions, this is what we know from our historical memories. In every family in the region, we have stories about this. So many of us are reliving this experience, and that emotional trauma actually does basically translates into action. So from that point of view, I've been thinking the last 3 months, I only traveled to Berlin and eastwards, to Central and Eastern Europe. I haven't been. And for me, the question is, why not? Is it because things are happening here, or because we are not listened to in other European capitals? So for me, that's the question, work in progress in terms of finding out. But every cloud, basically, or every sort of silver lining has a cloud that, in certain respects, we have a bit, it's a Europe of different speeds when it comes to geopolitical awakening and in terms of actually understanding what's happening. And from that point of view, going back to the quality majority voting, paradoxically, it seems to me, not despite the war, but rather because of the war, there is less interest, certainly in Poland, which actually pooling sovereignty, when that sovereignty basically may be used against something which was perceived of the vital national interest in the frontline states like Poland or the Baltic republics. So it's a double-edged sword in terms of actually pooling sovereignty and sort of shifting gravity center.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that's all we can do at this panel. We have to wrap up. Thank you that you asked so many questions, and sorry that we were not able to answer all of them. Thank you so much, and thanks to all the panelists. Enjoy the coffee break, and we'll be back with the next panel. Thank you.